on the estimated future impact of climate change based on latest scientific evidence and intergovernmental panel on climate change scenarios. Even if we can perfect methods in future, and we need to do that in future, we need to weigh today what the subject just it seems to me this one is good. Hello, hello.
Testing. Hello. This one is writing.
Okay. Even if we can perfect our methods in the future, we need to weigh today what the numbers suggest, so we can prepare better to take decisive, effective action. What is unquestioned, though, is the way the findings confirm the global injustice of the climate crisis. Those hardest hit are those least responsible for and least equipped to tackle the crisis. And indeed, yesterday in another forum, I was saying that even as we speak, they are also investing their monies in terms of adaptation. Even so, even the poor are even investing, and I will show you subsequently a different forum. This report demonstrates the extent to which negative impacts will grow as we close in on Paris prescribed 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature limit, as well as how significant the avoided impacts will be versus higher levels of warming. We hope, and we will take action, so the world will pay closer attention to and use the act on the findings of the Climate Vulnerability Monitor. The third edition of the Climate Vulnerability Monitor contains very specific counsel the world should brace for a rapid escalation in climate shocks. And as we near the breach of 1.5 degrees Celsius in the coming decade, we must prepare for the following impacts. 1, 8.5% projected global increase of days with very high or extreme high wildfire danger. 2, 350% increase in the number of vulnerable people exposed to heat waves, some 5 trillion more person hours of heat stress risk year. 3, a 12% of areas with no historic malaria suitability becoming new malaria transmission hotspots, including the re-emergence of dengue fever in the European Mediterranean countries. I'm referring specifically to countries such as Greece, Italy, and Spain. Those of us from Africa know that we used to share the malaria pandemic with them, but they have freed themselves. But the climate change threatens to bring malaria back to the Mediterranean regions. So we need to pay close attention to the Council of Scientists, because climate change is all permeating, and failing to do so will only put the lives of people in jeopardy. I also hope evidence-based analysis also results in people-centered new investments towards the low carbon transition and adaptation. We most urgently need to fortify our economies, supply chains, and communities against accelerating climate-fueled risk. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. And now it's my pleasure to invite the Honorable Henry Kokofu, who is the Special Envoy of the CVF Presidency, and he's going to read the statement from the Minister of Finance of Ghana's Senior Technical Advisor, the Professor Bafo. So thank you very much for being with us, Honorable.
Thank you, Matthew. His Excellency, the Minister for Environment, Ghana, colleagues, panelists, good afternoon, participants and friends. Allow me to firstly congratulate the CVF and the V20 for launching the third edition of the Climate Vulnerability Monitor. The role of data-driven evidence of the effects of climate change cannot be emphasized enough in shaping solutions to the climate problem in a way that is in alignment with the latest scientific knowledge and takes into account our unique national circumstances. The CVM3 findings indicate both the magnitude of the avoided impacts relative to greater levels of warming, as well as the extent to which adverse effects will worsen as we approach the Paris Agreement of 1.5 degrees centigrade temperature limit. The report finds that the risks are piling up and economies need to be ready. Data and science point to the fact that inflation will be up by 66% if we breach the 1.5 degrees centigrade. This is nothing short of alarming with the way inflation continues to disproportionately penalize V20 communities and economies still struggling to recover from COVID pandemics, either directly or indirectly. Even as those hardest hit are least responsible, particularly vulnerable, and with the most limited capacities or resources to cope, no country is spared. Indeed, countries previously theorized to benefit economically from global heating, such as those with present low annual temperature levels. Example, Canada, Russia, Scandinavia. The CVM3 assessment shows that economic losses due to the extrapolated effects of climate change based on already observed disturbances in the real economies of these countries. Climate warming also poses major threats to food security. The CVM3 finds that with recurring droughts and extreme precipitation, changes in crop production and yields will be altered that will affect both food supply and income for about 600 million farms globally, 90% of which are operated by smallholder and subsistence farmers. The report finds that 58% of the shortening in crop production duration could be avoided globally if climate commitments were met and global temperature rise was kept at 1.5 degrees centigrade. If no climate action is taken, moderate or severe food insecurity will increase by 12.8% globally towards the end of the century, 10.90% higher than under a scenario compatible with 2 degrees centigrade warming. Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, climate-fueled risks have driven up the cost of capital and debt unsustainable levels, especially across climate-vulnerable economies, worsening already horrific financial protection gaps. Safeguarding the 1.5 degrees Celsius centigrade, 1 degree centigrade safety limit of the Paris Agreement is critical, as it is the need to double adaptation and availability of pre-arranged finance. Such measures can lower the impact of climate change, make vulnerable country economies more resilient, safeguard sustainable development, and protect the lives and livelihoods of poor and vulnerable people. The CVM3 provides us with the scientific evidence and grounding we need to take heed of this cue in our response to the climate problem. And here I would like to draw your attention to this. V20 countries are losing $525 billion in loss and damage. And that we want to say payment overdue. Thank you very much for your attention. May God bless you all.
Thank you so much, Honorable Kikofu, and for reading the statement from Professor Bafor. So now we're going to move to the presentation of the findings of the monitor, starting with Dr. Thabea Lissner, who will provide us an overview of the biophysical impacts that were assessed by her team at Climate Analytics. Thank you, Thabea.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for coming. My name is Thabea Lissner. I'm head of vulnerability and adaptation at Climate Analytics, and I'm also a lead author of the working group 2 of the 6th assessment report to the IPCC that was published earlier this year. It's great to have the opportunity to provide a short overview of some of the key findings that we were able to contribute to the Climate Vulnerability Monitor. We developed these results together with the Mercator Institute for Global Commons, the Global Data Lab, and the Climate Media Factory. Of course, the report itself contains a lot more insights and a lot more granularity, especially also on the socioeconomic effects of climate change. But I'd really like to focus on some of the key findings with regard to biophysical impacts. So if you could move to the next slide, please. Thanks. So to jump right in, climate change is already causing impacts across the world, across all sectors. So for the report, we did some attribution work to really understand in how far the 1.1 degrees of warming that we currently have actually already has signals in terms of changes in temperature and precipitation. And what we find is that currently around 85% of the population globally already live in regions in the world that really have a very clear signal of climate change that can be attributed to anthropogenic global warming. It must be noted that especially for CVF countries, that number is likely an underestimate because we do have a lot of issues with data availability that make it more difficult to actually attribute changes, but we do still see that very clear signal. Using machine learning algorithms, we also assessed the huge wealth of literature that by now already documents the impacts of these changes in climate, so on different sectors, but across different regions as well. And we assessed the algorithm was able to assess over 100,000 papers. And what you see here on this map, I guess it's quite difficult to see, but we really have an unequal distribution of that information across the globe. If you look at the per capita distribution of these studies, we have about 80 studies per 100,000 inhabitants in OECD regions, compared to around 20 studies per capita in CVF countries. So there's still quite a lot of studies, but we definitely see that the most vulnerable regions have much less visibility in the documented impacts, even though, of course, they do bear the brunt of impacts. We also looked in quite a lot of detail into the projected changes of climate. The overall report in all sections actually looks into 3 different scenarios. We looked into a 1.5 consistent scenario that assumes that temperatures are stabilized around 1.5 degrees over the century, and compared that to a just below 2 degrees scenario that would reach around 1.8 degrees towards the end of century, which must be noted is not compatible with the Paris Agreement because it does go beyond what is agreed there, and compare that to a basically no climate action scenario that would reach around 3.6 degrees of warming towards the end of the century. What we see is that global warming under all scenarios causes negative impacts. So also 1.5 degrees causes many additional impacts that will be severe in many regions. But really limiting warming to 1.5 minimizes those impacts that all regions face. We do see changes in temperatures, droughts, extreme rain events, but also in crop production, for example. And also do see that there's quite an unequal distribution of these impacts across the world. To maybe provide one specific example of what we looked at in this table, you do see a few numbers. For drought events, for example, we see a 4 to 8-fold increase in the likelihood of drought events at around 1.5 degrees of warming. And already in the below 2-degree scenario, that increases to 8 to 12-fold of an increase of drought scenarios. And of course, further increases towards the end of the century. What we see here that especially for the higher emission scenarios is that the range of projections gets much, much wider, which makes it much more difficult also to plan to adapt to these changes. So not only are the changes much more catastrophic and more difficult to adapt to anyway, but also the increasing uncertainty with higher levels of warming puts an additional stress on actually developing scenarios of how to address these changes. We also looked into adaptation and how far adaptation is already occurring across the world. Of course, adaptation is one of the central coping mechanisms or central things that we need to address together with mitigation in order to address the changes that we see. There is a lot of progress in adaptation planning and implementation across the world, but it's insufficient to actually address the changes that we're already seeing today. There's currently a focus more on economic and technological sectors in terms of adaptation, and much less adaptation invested in education, health, and also the environmental sectors. But of course, these are also essential sectors who really need to invest in adaptation more heavily. What is really important to note is that the effectiveness of adaptation efforts will really depend also on mitigation efforts, because increasing limits to adaptation will be reached. Already under current warming scenarios, we do see especially soft limits to adaptation emerging, which will require transformational adaptation in order to adapt for many regions, but that will only increase with additional warming. In addition, it's very important to note that already today, but also in the future, even effective adaptation is not going to be able to avoid all losses and damages. So that is certainly something that will increase in the future as well. So a very important topic, of course, for the discussions here as well. So to summarize some of the key takeaways of the report, we see that the current warming of around 1.1 degrees of warming is already causing severe impacts across the world, across natural and human systems. It's absolutely critical to limit warming to 1.5 degrees because this warming also has severe impacts on socioeconomic development. And in order to really, also be able to reach the SDGs, it's absolutely critical to invest in reaching or in limiting warming to that goal. Already now, but especially above 1.5 degrees, especially the vulnerable regions will reach limits to adaptation. It's going to be increasingly difficult to adapt to the projected changes, and adaptation finance are absolutely essential to reduce climate risks already today. And finally, again, just to point that out, adaptation, even when effective today and also in the future, will not be able to reduce all of the projected losses and damages. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Tabea, for that overview and for all the work on the biophysical and science consortium aspects of the CVM3. So now we're going to go to Marina Romanello, who is the Executive Director of the Lancet Countdown on Climate Change and Health. And they have some extremely exciting new data in this CVM3. Somehow the first ever projections that the Lancet has put forward in terms of how health risks will evolve over the coming decades and century. So I'll pass to Marina. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Matt, and thank you everyone for being here. As Matt said, I'm the Executive Director for the Lancet Countdown. I'm going to tell you a bit about what the Lancet Countdown is, but first of all, I want to thank the CVF for the opportunity of putting health into the monitor. And I will tell you a bit about why that is. It is enormously exciting for us. And Matt said it's the first time we do projections. There's a reason for that. There's a reason why up until now we did not have robust projections on the health impacts of climate change. And I really thank you so much to the CVF and the V20 for putting the focus in this central issue. Next slide, please. So the Lancet Countdown, you probably have not heard of it. The Lancet is the world's biggest and most influential medical journal. It keeps the pulse on global health and is the highest impact factor scientific journal in the world by far. We are a project of The Lancet. The Lancet in 2009 decided to do the first ever commission on climate change and health because it understood that climate change is fundamentally a health issue. And the conclusion of that commission is that climate change is the biggest global health threat of the 21st century. And why that is not today even headlines in every news, to me, is a mystery. We're dealing with the biggest threat to our health, to our existence of the 21st century. In 2015, just 6 years later, the health community had moved fast enough in producing the evidence that the second commission of The Lancet on climate change and health was published. And that second commission concluded that yes, climate change is the biggest global health threat of the century. But most importantly, that climate action is the biggest global health opportunity that we have today. And that is because climate action today will not only avert the disasters that I'm going to show you in a minute, but also would deliver immediate health co-benefits. Everything we need to do in terms of tackling the climate crisis through mitigation, through adaptation, aligns really closely with the most sensible public health interventions that the health community has been asking for so many years. Stronger health systems, preventative medicine, cleaner air, healthier diets, reduced malnutrition. So everything that we can do for our planet is also incredibly good for our health. And that is because our health and our environment are inextricably linked. We cannot have good health if we don't have a healthy environment. Since 2015, the Lancet Countdown was established to monitor the extent to which the Paris Agreement was delivering on the health protection that we were calling for and on the health co-benefits of climate action. And since then, we produced 7 iterations of annual indicators. We have over 44 indicators. And these indicators are retrospective. They look back. They try to see where we're at today compared to the recent past. And these models have been published by different researchers in different journals and then pulled together in a Lancet Countdown, peer-reviewed 7 years in a row and improved iteratively to ensure that we have the most robust and the best models that we can in order to assess the health impacts and opportunities that arise from this response and impacts of climate change. And that is what we've been doing with the CVF. We took these models and said, what would happen in the future if we do not act now versus what would happen if we do take action today? Next slide, please. So climate change is affecting our health already today through many different pathways. And I don't expect it to absorb this graphic. But what I want to highlight here is that climate change is a starting point, but then it affects our health, that is the bottom row there, through many different paths that often interact, intersect, and add on to each other. And we're already seeing infectious diseases spreading around the world. We're seeing threats to our food security, to our water security, to the air that we breathe, with allergens being much more common, particularly because of the rising temperatures. We have much more pollen, much more air pollution that we're exposed to. We're seeing more and more people exposed to extreme weather events, and this is both big storms as well as heat, extreme heat events that are a health emergency, especially for the vulnerable communities, people over 65 years of age, very young children. Heat exposure and heat stress is a health emergency. So there you can see on the left what are the different elements that we've been assessing with the CVF. We've been looking at heat and health, exposure of vulnerable age groups to heat waves, heat stress during physical activity. We already have evidence that the safe hours for physical activity are being reduced today. And physical activity in many geographies is already a health risk rather than a health benefit, with enormous impacts to our the reduction of chronic diseases. We're also seeing that the rising temperatures affect our labor productivity. It's very hard to work in extreme heat, and it does reduce our physiological performance. It puts those vulnerable laborers at risk, and the agricultural sector, that is generally the most vulnerable sector, is also the most exposed. We're seeing increase in heat-related mortality, and all of that is just the tip of the iceberg. Underneath it, you have an increase in heat-related morbidity as well, adding extra pressure to our health systems. We're seeing extreme weather events. They spoke about heat waves, but we're also seeing an increased risk of wildfires. And wildfires not only put our health directly at risk, but it also undermines our assets. It has economic costs. It leads to loss of infrastructure. And it also leads to exposure to air pollution that has chronic effects once we're exposed to it. And exposure to wildfire danger is increasing because of the higher temperatures and the drier weather. Because the temperatures are changing, because the weather patterns are changing, we have changes in humidity, in rainfall, and we're seeing more and more infectious diseases spreading, as was said before by the minister, to new locations. We're seeing the highland areas of Africa, previously relatively safe from malaria, now being exposed to malaria. And we're seeing dengue risk increasing in Europe, re-emergence of infectious diseases. So no one is safe, although the most vulnerable countries are the most affected. And food insecurity is probably what worries us the most. We're seeing the increased incidence of extreme events affecting our crop productivity, affecting our labor productivity, but also we're seeing, as in the other section done by FINRES, enormous financial impacts of climate change, which undermines our capacity to access the food that we need. So we're looking at the extent to which our crop yield potential is being reduced directly through the exposure to heat, but also to the extent in which our food insecurity is being threatened and directly related to the increased incidence of heat waves. Next slide, please. So I'm going to show you just some of the results that we have. I'm not going to bore you too much with data because everything is in the report, and I really do not expect you to read that writing there because I know it's really small. But one of the perhaps most striking findings is the expected increase in heat-related mortality. And we're seeing that without further adaptation, if we consider no protective measures more than today are implemented, we would expect over 3 million more excess annual deaths around the world by 2090 if we take no climate action today. That is 3 million people, a 1,550% increase from baseline. However, if we took action today to limit global mean temperature rise to about 1.5 degrees, we estimate that over 90% of those deaths could be averted. We could save 91%, almost 3 million lives each year by taking action today. If, on the other hand, we go to 2 degrees, that, as we've heard, is not compatible with the Paris Agreement, this would only be 56% of lives saved. So there's enormous benefits of being ambitious today. What you can see in that graph is that really no region is safe, but particularly the hottest areas of the world and the most vulnerable areas of the world are the ones that are expected to see the most impacts. And that has to do with two things. One, the very high temperatures, which will become unlivable. They will exceed physiological thresholds. And second, the fact that the population is aging, and that is desirable, but we cannot have healthy aging in an unhealthy planet. I talked a bit about infectious diseases, and I think this one is quite interesting. If we took no climate action, we would see 26 more countries around the world seeing conditions suitable for dengue outbreaks. During the COVID pandemic, you must have heard about the R0, that number that if it exceeds 1, it means that we are exponentially replicating the virus and having an outbreak. That is what this means. We'll have the conditions in the environment. That means that 26 more countries can have conditions suitable for outbreaks. Again, by taking ambitious climate action today, we could avert many of these increased cases of dengue around the world. And one thing that is interesting, if you consider on the map, is that we're seeing the hotter, the most vulnerable regions around the world, seeing an increased suitability of to dengue transmission. But under the no climate action scenario, the worst level of warming, we project through our current models that there could be a reduction in the environmental suitability for dengue transmission in places like South America, the North Africa and Australia that are today endemic. However, these models don't take into account that once a mosquito and a virus is established, they're exceptionally good at adapting and evolving. So it's very hard to get rid of them, even if the conditions change. So that probably does not take into account evolution of the mosquito and the virus. Next one, please. And the final bit that I'm going to show you is, I think I have one or two, exposure to wildfire danger. I talked a bit about this already. But we're seeing that human exposure to days of very high or extremely high wildfire danger that is only determined by climatic conditions, so this is directly related to climate change, is expected to increase by 34% to just 12.3 under a 2-degree scenario, and only to 8.5 degree increase under a 1.5 degree scenario. One thing worth noting for is that even under 1.5 degree, we are expecting to see health risks increasing. So it's already dangerous today at 1.1. We show it in our Lancet Countdown report that at 1.1, we're seeing increasing danger. At 1.5, 8.5 is really not okay. And we really need to start adapting to those conditions. And finally, I mentioned a bit food insecurity, and I only want you to see the colors in that map. The darker, the worse. If we take no climate action, food insecurity, that is today already a problem and is on the rise today since 2017, would increase by 12.8 percentage points globally by the end of the century. Again, 12.8 percentage points. Hadn't we signed the SDGs already? This could only be limited to 1.9 under 2 degrees of warming. Again, you're seeing almost every area around the world being affected by food insecurity. And we know how international food markets work. So no one is safe from this threat. So just to wrap up, what we're seeing is that climate-driven health risk will increase in all scenarios. 1.1 degrees of warming is already not safe. 1.5 degrees of warming is already not safe. And 3 degrees of warming or more, as we're headed, is probably quite catastrophic. Therefore, we need to implement adaptation to ensure that as we head to 1.5, we're protecting the most vulnerable populations. And that requires funding, as we've heard. But it also requires knowledge on the ground and implementation. We're also seeing that the exacerbated health risk will be seen in every country. No country is safe. However, the most vulnerable will be the most affected unless today we take urgent action to promote a just transition. And again, there's a payment overdue to enable that. But what we're seeing most importantly is the enormous savings in terms of health impacts of climate change that could be achieved today if we were to take robust action. And while Tabi already mentioned the limits of adaptation and how hard it is already today to adapt to climate change, if we don't take action today, we won't be able to adapt to anything at all. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you so much, Marina. And thank you also to, Marina, you represent actually dozens and dozens of medical experts who threw their time into this report this year to come up with these incredible bank of information. So we really appreciate that. And thank you so much for all the effort. So now we're going to
Hi, can you hear me? I'm just checking.
Yes.
Okay, okay, because we couldn't hear you. I'm sorry. Let me share my screen. I hope you'll see it. I don't think, for the interest of a connection, I'm going to share my video as well, because it seems a bit patchy, at least on our side. So I hope you can see my screen. It doesn't seem to show up. Is it working?
I think it's, yeah, we're starting to see something. Yes, we can see you. The screen is live.
Okay, there is like a 1 minute delay, but it's okay. I hope you can hear me. So thank you, Matthew. Thank you, the CVF team, and also the other colleagues and co-authors of this report. It's a real pleasure to present the findings. I think if we could summarize our analysis in one picture, this would be the picture that you see at the bottom. Like it looks great, but it's going to be even worse the further we go if we don't change direction. That's a summary of the analysis that we've done on the economic aspects of climate change for the CVF and the CVM. What we've done for the CVM3 is novel and non-novel at the same time. We've been looking at 3 key macroeconomic indicators. The first one is GDP growth. As you might be well aware, there have been quite a number of publications over the last decades on this topic. Started even like in the 1970s, that got a few scientist and economist the Nobel Prize, I think 2 years ago, for their work on the connections between climate change and economic indicators. So this work started in the 70s, and there have been like more and more research coming up in the last 10 years, since 2015, more or less, on this issue. What is less covered currently by the scientific research is the relationship between climate change and inflation, and climate-related disasters and inflation. There is a few studies which are currently available. You have, for example, this one from Parker in 2018 that looks into this effects, but it's, in most cases, this is related to a single area, a single type of climate-related disasters or extremes. And then they try to look at the consequences of inflation, short-term, long-term, to see how it could affect the consumer price index. So this is what we find. And unfortunately, what is even less covered at this stage, and it's really concerning, especially in the perspective of development and development investment, is the relationship between climate change, climate-related disasters, and interest rates. Interest rates are extremely important for governments because they actually determine their ability to invest into their own development, to invest into adaptation, to invest into mitigation. The reason why it's important is because the higher the interest rates, the lower the capacity of governments to invest. And if you add to that the fact that the GDP could reduce, that inflation could increase, we face some kind of like a perfect macroeconomic storm for most of the countries. And this is what we wanted to better understand for this work and this analysis. And this is based on peer-reviewed publications that we had, like I think 2 years ago in 2020 in World Development, where we produced and got published this model that connects climate-related disasters, climate variables, let's put it like this, and macroeconomic variables. We've done it for GDP, now we applied it to inflation, and then taking the results for GDP and inflation, we looked at what could happen for interest rates. I'll be super fast in methods and data. I don't think this is the place for that. Just wanted to say, like, we used exactly the same data set as Marina's team and Tabea's team as well, in the sense that, like, we wanted to make sure there is like similar assumptions across the different groups, same precipitation data, same temperature data, the same scenarios, the same models, and so on and so forth, coming from ZMIP database. What the difference is that we used different methods, of course, econometric on our side, and also like the Taylor rule, like for interest rates. And we use socioeconomic data coming from the World Bank or ILO, the International Labour Organization, in something which what we would like to call like fairly replicable and transparent, because you used an econometric approach. Like anyone in a Ministry of Economics or Ministry of Finance nowadays knows pretty much how to run a regression. So like this is the way we looked at this impact. And now looking into GDP and GDP per capita growth, these are one of the findings. Like, it's something I didn't show last time at the press conference. We didn't have much time, but I really want to insist on that. I hope you see the lines, it might be a bit thin. What we see here is that from the left, the lowest income levels, so like low income and lower middle income, to the right, the high income level. The shape of a curve that you find, and this both drops at the extremes, is actually the effect, the negative effect of climate-related or like precipitation extremes to the GDP. What is very clear is that the richer you get, the lower the effect. Oh, you would tell me that's not really a novel thing, what you're telling us here, but the big difference here is that we can quantify it. And we can very clearly see the difference across the different income levels, from like a very strong impact, as we could see in lower income levels and low income levels in countries, to all the way down to high income countries where there is barely any impact that countries would experience. And basically, the richer the country, the lower the GDP vulnerability. And if we look at the results, they are quite interesting, that despite this lower vulnerability to extreme precipitation, we can still see a vulnerability to temperature change, and especially in the northern economies. And it goes somehow in line with the results that Tabea was showing earlier, and also that Marina was showing earlier, is that we see like significant changes for northern economies. For example, in malaria, that didn't exist back in the days, or like until now, that could become possible in these countries across the century. So this is what we find. In most cases, I would like to say, like for GDP, also for inflation, or you'll see for interest rates, we find like some kind of a diagonal going from Central Asia, Middle East, North Africa, Western Africa, that would be some of the most affected countries for different reasons that we keep on unpacking and trying to better make sense of, but like we see this kind of diagonal that emerges in most of our analysis. And the deviation in GDP per capita growth would be up to 35%, basically a third lower GDP growth in most of these countries that would be affected. And then if we look at inflation is the same. I'm showing you these results that are a bit like directly coming from the model, but I think they're quite interesting to look at, especially when you look at inflation for the low income levels. I don't know if you see my mouse, but like basically for the second chart on the top row, we see like the inflation in these countries is fairly responsive to extreme dry events. That makes sense. Like the lower the production in the country, the higher the inflation. But here we can model it and we can see it, and we can clearly see the difference in magnitude across the different countries. If you look at the end of the spectrum, for the upper middle income and the high income countries, the line is flat. There is barely any effect of like extremes, precipitation extremes on inflation in these countries. Nothing new, I know, but at least we can quantify it and we can see the difference in terms of magnitude across the different countries. At the bottom here is the same, but like what we looked at is the share of agricultural GDP, of agricultural value added in the GDP, to look at the effect in the different countries. And this is the same story emerging. The higher the share of agricultural value added in the GDP, the higher the vulnerability of inflation to extreme dry events. So this is the story that comes across like for most of the countries that we had using the econometric analysis. And then here, the results, you have the impression I put the same map, just change the legend. No, it's a different map, and the legend is also different. What we see here is the deviation in terms of inflation. It's using percentage points. And then what we see is like the change across the century for at different levels of warming, different periods. And again, we have the same story emerging. Central Asia, the Middle East mostly affected, Northern Africa as well. We see Egypt quite in red on this map, and also Western Africa would be the most affected countries when it comes to inflation. So this is a similar story coming up, combining both the GDP and also the inflation. And then I don't know if there is anyone interested in central banking in that room. And here's like the very novel part of the results. We use this rule called the Taylor rule. I don't want to show too much equations. This is the only one. I'm not even going to talk about it. But actually, it's a rule used by most of the countries, even low to middle to high income countries, to relate GDP per capita or GDP growth to inflation. And this rule is used in quite a number of countries, either explicitly or implicitly, to define interest rates by central banks. So this is what we use. The rule is rather old, I would like to say, from 1993, but still being used in most of the countries. And here what we find is that it's here measured in basis points. There is a bit of a difference. 1 basis point, basically it's 1 percentage point. For those not really familiar with like this kind of like financial topics. And here what we find is that for most of the countries, we would have like a limited deviation for the median. But what we can find is that like for some of the countries, there would be like a significant change up to 1 percentage point. 1 percentage point doesn't seem much. You would think like, oh, it's not so much 1 percentage point. But when a country has to borrow $1 billion to invest into whatever infrastructure or adaptation or mitigation or like schools, as Tabea was talking about, 1 percentage point makes a very big difference. And here we're only talking about the median. We're not talking about the extremes. If we look at the extreme deviation for year to year, that could be far higher. And this is what we can find for some of the countries. And overall, the story that emerges from analysis is threefold. The first one is, from low to high income countries, there will be significant macroeconomic consequences. And unfortunately, they come together, where we'll see like lower GDP per capita growth, which means like potentially lower incomes in the countries, but at the same time, higher prices. Lower incomes, higher prices means like decreasing quality of life, decreasing purchasing power in most of the countries, which is not good. It's exactly what we're experiencing now. And you see the problems that most of the countries are facing socially, politically, and so on. So like this is maybe something which is more to come and more to be expected into the coming years and decades. But at the same time, and this is also what we are currently experiencing, is that the capacity of government to invest to counteract or to reduce these negative consequences is reduced because the interest rates are actually increasing. And what we will see and what we might face into the future is exactly this perfect storm of macroeconomic indicators: lower incomes, higher inflation, lower capacity to invest. So it's something that we need to really strongly reflect about, looking at the effect on health, looking at the effect on like the different yield and so on, like how this would translate at the macroeconomic level for the government and the economies. What's also very interesting, and I think it shows up in the different analysis for the CVM, is that northern economies are not immune to the impacts. What we've been saying and discussing for many years, and I'm coming from a northern economy myself, what we've been saying is like, oh, look, we're immune. It's going to be fine. It's mostly the poor people that are going to be affected. You know, it was a bit like the discussion in public debate and like in political parties and so on. But it might not be the case, and it's very strongly not to be the case. And maybe vulnerable countries, especially the CVF members, are currently at the forefront of the consequences of climate change. But like what they're currently experiencing is something maybe developed countries or like high-income countries will be facing in the next 10, 20, 30, or 50 years. So how do we learn? How do we adapt? And how do we make sure, and this is my last conclusions, that like we keep global mean temperature below 1.5 degrees? There are a lot of discussions on adaptation. There are a lot of discussions on loss and damage. But like what we need to define with mitigation is the scale and the magnitude of the loss and damage and adaptation we are going to need at the end of a century, even like in the next decades. And my concern, and we don't have data to back it up yet, is that like very likely, if we don't mitigate enough climate change in the next years, if not now, there won't be enough funding, there won't be enough resources to deal with adaptation and to deal with loss and damage. So like the debate, and I hope we'll come back to like a very strong push on mitigation towards 1.5, so that we can really make sure that we have in place the best insurance against catastrophic loss and damage. And I leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you, Florian. I hope you could hear the applause in the room for the hard work. Fascinating results, quite terrifying in terms of the economic implications of climate change, and a body of work that was actually also behind the poster on the wall here, the 526 billion that was referred to by the CVF Special Envoy at the start of this session, which is looking back to what the economic impact has been since the year 2000 for, at that stage, 55 of the CVF and V20 countries. So what Florian was presenting was how that evolves going forward into the future. And unfortunately, it goes from bad to worse. So all of this three sections, the biophysical, the health, and the economic, represent an enormous body of information. And all of that has been consolidated into a dedicated data platform, which we are making live today. So we have with us Dr. Bernd Hazel, who is the CEO of the Climate Media Factory. He's also not in Sharm el-Sheikh, but he is with us online. And he's going to walk us through the data portal and what you can find online there. Bernd, if you're online, can you let us know if you can hear us?
I can hear you. You cannot see me because I'm not allowed to share my video, and I'm also not allowed to share my screen. So maybe it's a good idea, since we had the idea that the connection is not great, that you might just play the recorded presentation that I gave you, so that everybody can hear me well and I can answer questions afterwards anyway.
All right, we can do that. Thank you, Bernd.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for lending me your ears for a couple of minutes and giving me the opportunity to present to you the key features of the Climate Vulnerability Monitor's Data Explorers and our approach to storytelling around the focus countries, the 5 focus countries of the report. We want the report results being used and seen, and obviously not only the executive summary and the key messages, but also the more in-depth, detailed country-specific projections of climate impacts and risks, the whole wealth of data that may help you understand the challenge a little bit better, argue at COP, or even plan and create a more resilient future for your country. That's why we created the CVM3 online tools. I'd say they put the monitor's data at your service or at your fingertips. There are 3 of them, one for the biophysical impacts, one for the health risks, and one for the economic implications. So let's see this in action. This is the Biophysical Data Explorer. It can be found, as can the others, through the CVM3 landing page on the V20 website. And when you select a country by clicking on a map or by searching here, you're given a menu of indicators that are grouped by temperature, water, wind, agriculture, and so on. And if you click on one of those indicators, you find a text that is understandable for non-experts and explains what the indicator says, what it is, why is it important for, what it is important for, and how it was calculated. And this graph shows the projected change in the future, including the uncertainty range, and it compares the selected country, like Ghana here, to all the other countries in the world, with these scattered dots below. The value depends on the selected scenario, so you can go below 2-degree path, and on the time slice, so you can go mid-century or end of the century. And things change on the map, obviously. The colors on the map represent the data. If you want to understand more about the choices here, you can click on the information button and it gives you some text to it. With the scattered dots here, you can also find the outliers for every indicator, the outlier countries. For example, with a bad scenario, the countries most affected by reduced maize yields, for example, here are projected to be Egypt and Saudi Arabia. And if you click on it, you can jump to the country. You can also tap into the large body of scientific literature that documents how changes in temperature and precipitation that are observed already today impact human and natural systems, terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems, for example, and cause losses and damage across sectors and regions. And you can dive into these. So now all 92 entries are shown. And if you want to see only those in a specific region, you get them filtered. And this square actually tells you something about the relevance of this publication for what you're looking for. And the link brings you to the publication. The next one is the attributable present impacts section, and it shows that human influence is changing the climate. It visualizes where the trends in temperature and precipitation can be attributed to human influence on the climate. And currently, as Tabea may have said already, at least 85% of the global population live in areas for which this is true. And finally, there is also a socioeconomic vulnerability index. It's called GDL Vulnerability Index. And this is driven by socioeconomic, demographic, and infrastructural factors. And obviously, you can zoom out and see how countries are affected, or how vulnerable countries are or will be in the future, and how this differs with the different scenarios. All data can be downloaded. So if you go on data download, you can choose your indicator of interest. You can either download all countries, or say you only want to have, I don't know, Ghana and all the countries around it. And then you get to choose the time slices and the reference data I don't want to have, below 2 degrees I don't want to have, and then you download a CSV file, and you can work with the data that may be interesting to scientists, but also to policymakers, I guess. This is available for all data explorers, for economics, for health. And if you go back up here, you go back to the specific explorer. Now I changed to the health explorer. And if you again choose a country, for example, Bangladesh, you can see other indicators, for example, around heat-related impacts, wildfires, risk of disease transmission, and malnutrition. So let's see loss of labor productivity, for example, and you can see that this is very unequally distributed around the world. This is what I'd like to say to the data explorers, and now I'd like to also show you something which is work in progress. We have a website called Stories, Impact Stories, and this is not yet populated with all the 5 countries, Bangladesh, Ghana, Kenya, Philippines, and St. Lucia, but we have something online for Kenya already. And this is, while like the data explorers makes the high quality data from the monitor a little more accessible, we wanted to go a step further with the impact stories. We wanted to show what these numbers mean for people in their everyday lives already today. And to this end, we conducted interviews with, well, farmers, with experts, with journalists that tell about what they can see.
Kwa muda sasa wa miaka kama 10-15 tumeona mabadiliko ya hali ya hewa. Mara mingi mvua tu, wakati tunapotarajia mvua, hiyo mvua inakuja kwa muda mfupi inapotea, ama inanyesha mvua kubwa kwa siku 2-3 inapotea. Hata saa zingine kwa wakati tunatarajia mvua, hiyo mvua tunaikosa kabisa, ama inanyesha sehemu.
Well, this is going to be online in a couple of days, and I invite you to look at that and see what locals have to say on how they are affected and will be affected in the future by the changing climate. We hope that these stories may help people move and take stark decisions on climate mitigation action and on adaptation finance. So please do not hesitate to ask questions by mail in case the internet connection is not good enough for live questions today. Enjoy exploring the tools. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Bernd. The video was great. And I think everybody got very excited here about the possibility of the data platform and all that makes available. I mean, this is incredibly sophisticated precision data for the whole world across all the main biophysical, economic, and health impacts. And I think the fact that it's all available now on a dedicated platform of data makes it all the more valuable for the whole range of uses for which it could be interesting. So that brings us to the close of the presentations, but we do have a little bit of time in case there's any questions in the room regarding the monitor. You have the authors in the room and online in case you have any questions, and we would be happy to field anybody's questions if that's the case. We have one at the back.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Dr. Shafkat from Pakistan. I have been part of one of the reviewers, yeah, from Pakistan. So many questions we at that time earlier stage we asked, but you know, one thing which wondered me here, I heard on the wildfire. But you know, look at the Saudi Arab's case, there is no forest, much forest. Then why, what could be the possible reasons? That is my question to ask. Thank you.
On wildfire?
So your question was around deforestation, is it? Land use change? Around wildfires. So wildfires are not only in forests, they're also in grasslands, or crops, for example. So what we're doing is measuring the extent to which the environmental conditions are becoming more and more suitable for wildfire incidence and spread. And what that means is we've cropped out cities, for example, but anything outside of a city that could be ignited is put at danger by the environmental conditions. And obviously there's a lot that can be done in terms of reducing that risk. And the very important point perhaps is that most of the wildfires or the bushfires or the wild grass fires are today man-made, are caused by human activity. Much of it has to do with agricultural management. Much of it has to do with intentional burning. But what this shows us is that once those fires start, the conditions are so much more suitable for them to spread out of control, and it's much more difficult to contain them. So it will not only be about forests, but anything that can be ignited outside of cities.
Thank you very much. And we were reminded actually that as a part of the development of the monitor, there were a number of independent expert reviewers, and thank you very much for your contributions, sir. And also 14 different regional partner organizations that came in, and we'll be having, in fact, engagement on further regional studies that will be stemming from this report in the near future. So do look out for those. We had a question from the gentleman in the fourth row. If you could introduce yourself and let us know.
Yes, Maclay Kanyang. Hello, can you hear me? Thank you so much. Maclay is my name, from Zimbabwe. Thank you very much for a fantastic presentation. We can't wait to get our hands on it to help us do our planning and what have you. But I would like to see this study extended to the health of animals and plants that we depend on, and also the possibility of crossover from humans and animals. I think that would give us a fuller picture. That was my comment.
Thank you so much. So I believe there's two dimensions to that question. One, the health of animals and plants that we depend on. I think, Taber, you could take that, and maybe the crossover from between animals and people could come from Marina. Taber.
Yes, of course, we're not separate from the ecosystems, and climate change will have already has major effect on ecosystems and will continue to do so. And a lot of discussions, I guess, also go around nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based approaches. And I think it's very important to note that we can only use these environmental services basically if we continue to invest also in healthy ecosystems. So I mean, there is some information also in the online tool and in the monitor about these aspects, but it's certainly a very, very important area to also further explore. Yes.
Thank you, Taber. Marina?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I 100% agree. And we have not been that good at engaging with the kind of the animal world in many dimensions. One of them is the impact of climate change on the livestock, on the animals that we depend on for food, for example. But the other is zoonotic diseases. There's an enormous impact in terms of the way that we're exposed to different species, the way that zoonotic diseases are spreading, and the way that biodiversity loss is affecting also our health. There's enormous gaps in the knowledge as well there, and it's really hard to quantify. But I absolutely agree that we should start putting more effort in terms of modeling how the animal world is being affected by climate change, and then take the extra step of saying, how are we then being affected by that impact on the animal world? Absolutely agree. Thank you for that.
Thank you so much. Do we have any? Yes.
Okay, thank you for the presentation today. And I'm from Mongolia, and every map, every data, Mongolia is really deeper, darker color, which means every scenarios like Central Asia, we do have affected hugely in terms of vulnerability in climate changes. But the main point here is we have enormous knowledge gap there, and also enormous capacity building job is waiting for us. And for myself as journalist, and also we need to huge amount of media campaign to get people educated about what are challenges happening. Because on the ground, and Mongolia is cold climate country, people are actually really enjoying global warming, but they don't understand what is the dangers coming. And after all those research and after all those results, what's your suggestion to adapt and mitigate all those vulnerability, especially for like the lower and middle income country like vulnerability? They also had a lower attention as well. What shall we do for
Thank you very much. Florent, if you're online, you could also jump in.
I just give it. Since the 19th century about the first IPCC report on health impacts, and talks about all of this, talks about extreme weather events, infectious diseases transmitted by vectors, food insecurity, heat stress. None of this is new. And why on earth are we not doing much about it yet? The media has an enormous role to play, and the way that we're communicating this. I generally give lectures, and I do this exercise of Googling climate change and seeing what images come out. And if you do that, you will see that you have a lot of leaves. Apparently, we're very worried about leaves, very worried about polar bears. You see a lot of scorched land. You see a lot of people holding the world in their hands. You don't see one picture of a sick child. You don't see one picture of a person suffering the health impacts of climate change. So we're still thinking of climate change as something that is a problem of polar bears in 2100, not something that affects us, our children, our livelihoods today. And that is a communications problem, because we have the good, robust evidence, but it's just not getting home. That is probably not accidental, but there's a lot that we need to do in terms of communicating better. And we have in our indicator report of the Lancet, we have one indicator where we monitor the extent to which press and media are replicating news and communicating around climate change, around health, and around the intersection between climate change and health. So that is crucial. To me, the big question mark still is, how do we get this data to drive action? And I think these reports and getting the platform out there does a huge amount of work, but I still want to see whether policymakers are going to use it and whether it can be used to inform change, and how we can help them use this data better to drive what's happening in the other rooms down the corridors.
Thank you very much, Marina. Florent, if you can hear us, do you want to have a comment to that question?
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. But I just heard like a part of a question, and then I heard Marina speaking extremely fast because I think Zoom was trying to catch up. No, what I want to say, I think it's from what I understood from the question, I think media can play a role, but like I also very much wants to insist on the responsibility that we have.
So
like,
Florent, can you speak up a bit, just because there's like pavilions on all sides here in Sharm el-Sheikh and it's very loud.
Okay, sorry. No, what I was saying, I think the media has a very important role to play. But also, I think we shouldn't neglect who we want to talk to. Of course, the common population is important, but I think it's like the financial people that we also need to talk to. We need to be able to divert a lot of the finances, which is going into, I would like to say, old sectors, into new sectors, and I think Mongolia is a very good example of that. From what I understand, and I know very little of Mongolia, I know like a lot of the energy is actually coming from coal and non-renewable energy sources. What could be done in the country so that it goes into a better direction? It does have to do with a media campaign. Does it have to do with like helping new finances coming into the countries? Maybe it's international donors that need to come in the country to help with that. So it's some of the questions that we need to ask. I think, if I may, in 2022, we're not very much. Information is important, but now it's really time for action and implementation. And I think we need to be very pragmatic about like what we can do, we can do it. Adaptation is important, but like as much as we can, we need to make sure like the new investments which are being made in whichever economy on the planet actually goes into the right direction in terms of resilience, the right directions in terms of mitigation, especially. So I really encourage you to go ahead with a media campaign in Mongolia, but I think you need to target, you need to be very clear about who you want to target and what kind of action should be emerging from that. And for me, the action that should be emerging is like pushing the finances into the right direction and accepting that some of the sectors will progressively go away. We're not going to kill them, but progressively they're going to go away. And we need to get this acceptance into the societies, and we need to get the financial sector in moving into that direction as well. I hope you could hear me. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. That was great, Flo. And Mongolia is a member of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, and maybe they would also be interested in the Climate Prosperity Plans program that is part of the activities that members undertake, because it does attempt to resolve a number of those questions at national level, making use of the data, all of the data in this report actually going forward. So somebody in the pavilion could provide you more information if you're interested in that. I think we'll wrap at this point. The experts remain here in case you need to have further discussion with them. Just in closing, to say that this was the third in a series from the Climate Vulnerability Monitor. The first one was issued in 2010. It was based on simply using existing models that were out there, which proved in a sense to be quite flawed because they gave very strange results when you boil them down to country level. So that initiated a second Climate Vulnerability Monitor project where we tried to build indicators for different impacts from the ground up. One of the things that missed out is the interactions that happen in an economy and in society when you look at only one slice at a time. And that's partly why some of the work in this third edition is so much more sophisticated than what we've had access to in the past. The economic data is looking directly at the interaction of GDP itself as an economy as a whole. I think the level of sophistication of some of the indicators, the artificial intelligence being used in the biophysical section, all of the models that you have developed now for the different health indicators, this is really an incredible resource, and everybody hopes that I think the CVF and the V20 will be able to make maximum use of it, both domestically and for supporting advocacy towards stronger global climate action, such as through conferences here today. And just before closing, I wanted to say that there is also a secretariat team that has been helping to coordinate all this work. In particular, Alexandra Roxas, who's sitting here. I'm wondering why she's still standing, because she had very many sleepless nights to get this over the line. So please, a round of applause for Alex. And also Sarah Ahmed, who coordinates the work of the V20, who is probably off busy with a million things right now, but has been an integral part of getting this over the line. So we have to end on time, I'm afraid, because there is another program that the CVF and V20 has just moments away on the other side of the conference center. So, but thank you very much for joining us. I believe the authors and editors can stick around for a moment to maybe speak with you, but we hope you will get online, make the full use of the platform and the report, and thank you very much for your attention today. Thank you.